and founder of a company called DigiSite. And if anyone does need further introduction, I think just let me know on the chat and I will continue. Okay, so now we will go on to the actual coverage of today. So what I did yesterday or day before yesterday is we basically created a design of a web page or web app, sorry. And we said, in essence, it's a simple COVID web app where you basically capture someone will be going around capturing person's name, surname, ID, date of birth, and COVID status. I think I just have to. Can you all of you just put yourselves on mute? Okay, there you go. Okay, so in essence, we created this structure based on previous lessons that we engaged on, and the idea was for most of you to go around and actually try to create a web page or web app using HTML, CSS3, JavaScript, and maybe even a bit of PHP and MySQL to close it all off together. And what I'll be doing is I'll be going through the app itself and what I've done so that we can actually understand how the web app has been created in its end-to-end. And this would in essence be basically a full stack developer. So generally a full stack developer would look at creating the front end, the back end, as well as the database. So that's great. And I will continue. I'll constantly monitor for any items coming through on the chat, but we also then created the functionality that needed to happen. But in essence, let me go through the app itself. So this is the app that I created. And here, as it was designed, I created a menu, logo, COVID app, first name, last name, ID, date of birth, COVID status, and a submit form. It doesn't quite look exactly the same as this one, but for the purposes of this exercise, that's good enough. So we've got menu, logo, COVID app, all of those things, and a submit button. Now, I've just used the words logo, but the idea is that you would create these items per se. Now, when we look at this item itself, in essence, how did I create this? Well, let's go to the index page, which is the firstly, as we know that when you're opening up, it starts and loads the index, which is the most important, or it's the primary HTML page. And here we can see exactly the same document type, everything's the same. We created a link of the icon, right? And the title of the page, which is COVID app. If I go back into the web app, you can see here, it will say COVID app and the little icon that appears here. Now you can see this is a generic icon like Zoomer uses. It basically isn't very pretty. And when you create all your own apps, the idea is you should have an icon to actually show that. So now, oops, let's go back here and you can see, okay, so that talked to giving it a title, which is COVID app, putting a nice little icon that it can relate to, and all the styles that we're going to be using on the app. So we do know that when we create an HTML page, it's basically got no style, no structure. It's very, very ugly. And when we actually start creating structure or making the website pretty and looking nice, we're creating a CSS, cascading style sheet, which then makes it all pretty and nice. And that's what references it. So for example, if I comment this out and I save this, and let me open this index HTML, this is what it would look like. And as you can see, this is a very ugly representation. It doesn't look like a proper app, and we don't want that. So if we go back to the code, comment it back in and refresh. And as you can see, that looks much better. That just tells us what we want this thing to look like. Okay, then, now previously you looked at me and I only used divs. In this case, in the body, here we're referencing a navigation bar. Navigation bar, this indicates in HTML, there are a set of predetermined tags like user list, unordered list, the division, nav, body, these are all predetermined ones by HTML, but we could create our own. And like, for example, if I wanted to create my own tag here, I could say, look, I want division, but I want its class to be called, class is equal to test. And that basically allows me to create my own division. And when I'm referencing in the cascading style sheet, I won't reference division, I would reference test. And it would only apply to everything where the class is test. Now, what I want to actually take note of is sometimes I'm using ID and sometimes I'm using class. ID is a once-off representation. It means I'm only going to use this tag once. And when I reference it in my cascading style sheet, I'll use a hashtag sub-m. When I'm representing test, means I'm using it more than once. So I can use this class or classification many, many times. Here's an example. I'm using this class 3 times, and the reason is whatever I say on the hashtag, not hashtag, this time it'll be a dot class in the cascading style sheet. It will apply it to all 3 of these and not just the one. So let me take this code off and delete that. Okay, so now we're creating a navigation bar. And we created a type. We're basically saying, look, we have a menu, then we're going to have an unordered list and logo and title. So let's go back to the item. We can say we've got menu, logo, covert app. Now you're going to say, but hold on a second. In the unordered list, you've got home, about us, and contact us, but it does not show here. Because when I go to the cascading style sheet, which is main, you will see that on the sub menu, I've made its visibility hidden. I don't want it to show when it comes up. But when I drag it over there, I'm showing you that I've got a little pointer. Because there's a pointer. But when I click on it, the menu will come up, which then allows me to say, okay, I want to go to my pages, which is about us, or back to the menu, or I want to go back home. So we know that as part of the exercise, we said, so where was it? Okay, so here we said create, click or hover on menu, sub menu drops down for selection, and you need an about us and a contact info web page. Now, when you look at how we created it, we created 2 web pages here, about us and contact us. And when we go back to our index HTML, you can see we created a list item. And here we're saying at this, within the list item, we're creating a text item that has a link H reference to index HTML, and its name is home. So that means when someone sees home and they click on home, it will go to index HTML. When someone sees about us and they click on about us, it will go to about.html. And this is how we create a reference or link to an HTML page within an application. So to the person, this looks like one application. They don't know that there are 3 HTML pages, but rather it looks like it's all part of one web app, or or one application, one HTML page representing all of this content, and just has logic inside it. But as we know, this is one of the easiest ways to create it. Okay, so that was the navigation bar. And in the navigation bar, just being cognizant of time as well, but in the navigation bar itself, we made it a flex box because we wanted to do a cross. We created a border, the list items we already talked about, and then we designed each menu item. It's a title, menu, and logo. And then again, there's something for menu. And this seems a bit confusing because surely we've already addressed, styling for this, but how HTML and CSS works is it works progressively. So these are common things I wanted only for all 3 of them, but here's something specific to the menu item. And what happens is the item or the item that actually comes afterwards will be the last item that gets applied. So as you proceed sequentially, this takes priority. The last one takes priority. As you can see here, I said black background color is teal. Afterwards, I said background color is green. When we go back to the actual page, we can see that green overrode the teal that actually applied. So it's very important to know these little things around that. Now, The rest of the stuff is actually just there before. I think we've been through this before on how to create a form. And I'm not going to go through this again. Here we created the form itself. And finally, we created simple, very, very simple JavaScript. The JavaScript that says, okay, there's two things. So when I want to set the style to be hidden or visible. So here we can see, when am I using that stuff? It's to say, okay, if you open up, if you click on the item, if I click on menu, it will open it. And if I hover and move away, it will actually hide it. Okay, so now we are at that stage where we need to also look at what we asked ourselves to do in the app. So we said, okay, click or hover, submenu drops down for selection, about us, contact us, we've already checked, that works. From submenu items, you must have the ability to return to the main menu. Okay, so we've tested that as well. So when you go to the app itself, you can say, okay, I can go to menu. This is a submenu. When I go here, how do I get home? Well, here I've basically ensured that the same menu is applied for all 3 pages, and I can get home. Contact us, I can get home. Great, so we know the functionality works. And for all interest purposes, I will create the link. I will send the link onto the chat itself, where I put all of this code that I've created. So you can go about trying this yourself, but you can also reference the code that I've created as well to fine tune your own items around that. Okay, now we're saying when you click submit, you must check if data is entered and it cannot be blank. Check if ID number exists in the database. If exists, message user this ID or entered into the database. If it does not exist, create the entry into the database. We've also then said, this is what the database table should look like. And this is the code that I've created specifically for DBHT, PHP, because once you're actually interacting with the database, you're going to need backend code. In this case, we're using PHP because my host server has a PHP admin. Now, for all those that are worried, saying, look, you know what? I don't have my own hosted environment. I need to use this code. How do I go about doing all of this? Well, there's a thing called WAMP, a WAMP server. You can download it, it's free. And in essence, your WAMP server will give you a sort of a simulator of your PHP and MySQL environments, which means you don't need a web environment. And if you're using Windows, you use a WAMP server. If you're using Linux, you use a XAMPP server. And you can install this apparently on a Mac or a Windows operating system. So here we go. This is what you'd use. The instructions on how to set it up are all on the environment. To actually, you just go into Google, search for WAMP server or XAMPP server, and you'll get the link to actually download, install it, and then you just set it up to use it. You can also go into YouTube, where there are many tutorials on how to do this effectively. Great. Now, let's look at it. So now we do know 2 things. Let's look at the functionality that first checks if data entered, it cannot be blank. This we're doing on our web page itself. And what you'd look at is, for every input, I've created a little tag here called required. This means it's mandatory. You cannot use the submit button here without actually having information populated as it applies to all of these. So let's look at the application itself. So here I can try to submit now. It will tell me, please fill out this field. Okay, great. Please fill out this field, etc., etc. You know, it'll go into this. It'll go into this. Can I do this? No. Now we don't want to submit yet. So let's just do a refresh. Okay, because why we want to actually say, well, we can't do any of the submission if we haven't created the database and the PHP code. So let's look at it. Let's look at the database now. Here's PHP MyAdmin, which allows me to access the MySQL database. And in the MySQL database, exactly as we created, here's the COVID table, capital C as we created it. Here's the 6 fields we created it. Here's exactly as we said, integer text, integer date, and text. But however, firstly, we said none of it is allowed to be null. And then this field, COVID, is an auto increment field, which means I've made this field the primary key field, and no one can actually, you don't insert any data into this. We insert into your database. You insert into these 5 fields, and this automatically gets updated or inserted. Okay, so now we've created a table. The environment is, we know it's a MySQL environment, and we know it's a local host. Okay, so now we create a database.php file. Now I'm not going to show you mine because mine specifically has my username and password and all those lovely things, and you'd use your own. So what we've done is we said, okay, this is PHP code. Great. Our connection, we're creating a variable. This is a variable. So this is our own. You could call it anything that you want to. And here we're using the function of MySQL iConnect, the local host, which is the environment it's hosted in, a username, a password, and the database name. This is the database user, database password, and the database name itself. And this is basically, if you cannot connect, then there's an error. So that shows as a connection error. And at least we have an error trap there on this item itself. So you'd create this db.php, and let's go to environment. Where are we now? I need to be, that's going to, oh, here we go, file manager. Okay, so we created a COVID, I created a COVID link, and here you can see all of the files that we've got. About us, contact, the 2 HTML pages, index HTML, the db.php, the logo, which we created that shows the nice pretty logo here, and the main cascading style sheet, which styles everything. So now the only file we need to create to do all of the functionality to interact with our database is an insert PHP. So let's view this file. Okay, so once again, start off with, we're telling the database or the item that this is PHP code, so our PHP engine can run it. Now, we know that we created a connect, we created connect PHP or db.php file, which creates this connection to the actual database. And because you could use it multiple times, you don't actually embed it within this item, and you'll just include that db.php here. So in essence, as it starts, it's going to access and connect to the database. Now, basically checks your form. Is it a post? And have you clicked submit? And if it's yes, then this code gets applied within this brackets. So now the first thing is, you can see there, I've created 5 variables to allocate the 5 items that we are using. Now, everything is case sensitive. So let's go back here, and you can see the name that we use is the item that gets picked up by the form. Now we use the method of post. There's another method called get. The method of post is the better method because it's more secure, because when you use the method of get, the HTML tag, or let's call it the list that gets submitted on the browser, includes all the data. So you don't want people to have access to the data when it gets submitted. So you're using the data, you're hiding the data when you're using post. So now we can see fname, lname, ID, DOB, C status. Yeah, you can see fname, lname, ID, DOB, C status. And the method we used is post. Great, so we created our own variables. Now I'm using a query, and my query says select star from COVID, the database table where ID is equal to the ID that we actually get from this item. Why are we doing that? Because we said, hold on a second, check if the ID number exists in the database. So we need code that's going to check, does this ID exist? Now, create another variable on and result, and then using the connection. Remember, what is the connection? The connection came from the db PHP. So when we look at it, we created a variable called and connection, which is actually creating the SQL connection. So we go back here and we're saying, okay, create the connection based on the query that we've created here. And if there are any rows resulting from this query, we're not going to continue. We're just going to give a message that this ID already is entered into the database, and we'll end it. If it's not 0, then we are going to basically start the insert process. So we'll create an insert statement. We'll create the values based on the items we've got here. And if everything is good according to the SQL, it will say new record successfully added. If everything is not good according to our SQL or syntax, the values we've got posted, it's going to create a problem. Now, when we go back to the code, you'll notice I've also ensured that on HTML side, first name is text, last name is text, ID is a number. No one can put a text in, it will create an error. Date of birth is a date, which also then gives us a little icon that we use. If we look at the application, it allows us, it's got already predetermined functionality, which is user-friendly, nice to use in that regard. Okay, that's great. And finally, COVID status is text, which someone will just enter that in. Okay, lovely. Now we've shown how the database is designed. We've shown how the code actually is being utilized. Where was the code again? Here we go. Okay, and then we close in the connection at the end of that. Great. So now, when does this insert get called? Let's get back to the code. And here we're saying this is that on submit, nope, on the time that you post the form, which means when you click submit, the action you want to execute on is using insert.php. And that's which actually tells it what to do. And remember, this is case sensitive. So always make sure that if you've got an uppercase somewhere or lowercase, make sure it actually reflects that. Otherwise, you'll not find your errors. And that can be a long process for you. Okay, so now let's test this application out. Okay, so the first thing is we already tested that everything works in the sense that it checks that data must be there. My name, surname, let's just put, yeah, I haven't. One thing is important to note here, we could have put another validation check to say an ID has to be 30 numbers, and basically on that basis, it can also do another check, which is a good thing to do. But in this case, for the purposes of just showing you that we've got a number in here, let me just put a text and see what happens. Let's choose any date. COVID status is healthy. Here you go. It will ask you for a number, which is one of the validations we want. So now in this case, I'm using 1, 2, 3. We're going to try it out, submit it, what happens? Lovely, all the code works. Okay, let's go back there. Let's refresh this page. Let's go and check if our code is inserted. Let's go into the COVID table. And there we go. It's showing us a row has been inserted with a unique ID that it manages on 6. First name, Yashin, surname, Abed, ID 1, 2, 3, date of birth, healthy, great. Now let's test the other function that we're looking at. It says on this side, check if ID number exists in the database because you don't want a duplicate of ID 1, 2, 3. Well, let's go there again. Let's go Shin Abed, ID 1, 2, 3. Everything else it doesn't check for, so we don't care about the date of birth, anything. It's only going to check it based on this field. Let's check. This ID is already entered into the database. Great. Okay, saying that, but let's always check. Go back in, click on the table, check if there's a second entry, and there isn't. So that works well. Now we're going back to our functionality. What else did we want? If exists, message the user this ID already entered into the database. If it does not exist, create the entry into the database. So in this case, we checked everything works in that regard. And we've basically, therefore, then completed all of the content therein. Now, at that stage, we've covered every aspect around this. We've designed each page. We've created the HTML pages. We've styled each HTML page. We've created some base code for the menu. We've checked if it's responsive. No, we haven't. So let's go back there. Okay. On this side now, when we're checking if the page is responsive, we want to make sure that if I resize this, it adjusts it accordingly and it still looks like a good app. It doesn't like flow over each other. Things don't actually, things don't overflow. Things actually don't look ugly. And we also want to check that's just for responsiveness on different applications, or sorry, different laptops or desktops. But what happens when we actually try it on a Galaxy S5? Well, that's what it would look like. And we're thinking, it's not bad. That's good enough for the purpose of this. What happens if we try it on an iPad? Okay, that's still good. iPad Pro, still good. Let's go for an iPhone X. Okay, so generally, whether you're using those, you can remember, you can say, okay, you know what, I don't want any of those. I want my own sort of measurements, and I can then change things and see how it looks. And it's responsive, and it will adjust based on height, what's that, width and height. Great. Now we go back and we say, okay, I don't care now for that. We've checked that. Let's go back here, and we said, okay, now we've created everything around this item. We've seen the base code for the menu, and this was the nav bar. No, that wasn't the nav bar. There was. We haven't gone through the base code for the menu yet. Let me go through that as well. So on the menu itself, we could have had just the div ID for the logo itself, but what we're doing is saying, no, we want a sub menu under menu. So you can see we start the division for menu and we close it here. And inside we're creating an unordered list. And inside the unordered list, we're creating 3 list items, which was home, about us, and contact us. And that's how we created the sub menu. How did we style the sub menu? Well, the first thing is on the menu item is we wanted it green to show that it's interactive. The second thing we looked at is to say, okay, if all of that exists, we also want the list item to look like a pointer with padding around it. What do we mean? Let's go into it and saying, okay, when you look at it, there's gaps between about us and contact us. If we have a padding of 0, they'll almost sit on top of each other, and that wouldn't look pretty. Okay, so in essence, what we're saying is the menu is green. We've got this item, we've made it invisible. And when you go over it, you can see the lovely pointer to show that it's not just an arrow, it's interactive from that point. Okay, so here we're saying, okay, check if it's responsive, great. Create the table, database, and user. In that case, we went into it and I showed you where you'd create it. Unfortunately, we're not going to recreate the table, but you just need to know a bit of MySQL in that regard. Creating the PHP code. Now you'd only create PHP code. Let's go back here. If you look in this regard, my databases run on top of an engine that's PHP. So basically my host provider for my website says, look, I'm giving you PHP for free, so you can actually look at your backend code as PHP. But if you wanted to go for a better package where you can create your own server, you would then use Node. You could use a combination of PHP and Node, JavaScript, or Angular JavaScript, etc. Python. You could use any sort of engine on the back end, but then you'd have to create your own database for that. Normally, most of the database hosting sort of database, but hosts for web servers don't actually provide you with that upfront of the lower end packages. Okay, and someone like Afrios doesn't even look at support for that. Now, where were we? We're going through all the items looking at. We needed to create PHP code. We went live because, like I can show you again. Let's go here. Let's go, here we go, my file manager. Okay, so here you can see I went into public HTML. I created a COVID directory. Look at this. Here's my main website. And in the basically all you needed to do is go to COVID. You don't need to type index. You just go to COVID, delete this, enter, and that's what you'd see, right? Now, what else did we do there? Let's go here. In essence, in the COVID HTML, we put all of these files. The main file is the index.html. That would open first and reference all of these. Okay, great. Let's go back there to the test functionality. Okay, we've tested all the functionality around this item and it all works. So now let me go back to the drive itself. This is the drive. Let me copy the link. Let's copy the link. Anyone with this link will actually be able to access this. I'm putting the link there. And I will place all of the files except my file itself. So I'm going to also save this file there. I will this PowerPoint file. I will put this DB PHP where you can actually see the structure and stuff that you would need to put on for your local host will remain, but generally you need to obviously change your username, password, and your database name. Okay, so I'll put all of those items there for you to actually use as an example, but the best thing to do is remember, create a design. On this design, use that to create your HTML page, then style it according to your CSS, and then put your JavaScript for your functionality. In this case, it was only for the menu icon. And then your submit button, which actually will then have PHP attached to it. And in that case, we've got covering the full stack in this very, very rudimentary exercise. And this full stack talks to, okay, front end, we used HTML and CSS with, and then on the back end, which is firstly on the browser side, we use some JavaScript. And then on the server side, we use PHP, which we use to access the database and to then use the insert command onto the database. And then finally, the actual database side, we use MySQL. We created a database, you created a table, and you need to create a user, obviously, as well. And on that basis, we then can put that information into our db.php file for connection. And that basically talks to the full stack of development. So full stack developer will look at front-end developer, front-end and back-end development, which we did. I hope you found all of that interesting. And if you need any assistance in this, I think my details will be provided. But I'm hoping that you guys will go well and do well. And thank you very much for actually attending and watching this course or this workshop. Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to stop the share now, as well as stop the share, and I shall stop the recording.